The medal glitters, but the chains are hidden. On July 27, 2025, Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state in Africa, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. To many, it looked like the crowning moment of a lifetime, a recognition that echoed Mandela and Gandhi. Yet only 3 days later, the world gasped. He refused. He did not bow. He did not thank the committee. He tore the mask away. What was dressed as honor, he called a trap. A velvet chain woven by the G7, a golden shackle meant to bind a continent in gratitude. This was not merely about a medal. It was about sovereignty itself, about whether Africa must always wait for applause from capitals that profit from its silence. His refusal was thunder, echoing far beyond Ouagadougou, shaking the fragile walls of global diplomacy. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching. For this is not just a story of one man turning down a prize. It is the story of a continent daring to ask, is dignity worth more than $1 million? It began with applause. On the morning of July 27, 2025, headlines across the world carried one name, Ibrahim Traoré. In Oslo, the Nobel Committee announced his nomination for the Peace Prize. To the global press, it was a symbol of renewal. The youngest African leader nominated for one of the most coveted awards in human history. Comparisons flooded in. Mandela, Gandhi, icons of resistance and reconciliation. For a continent often described as a battlefield of crises, here was a moment of validation, or so it seemed. Yet the applause was short-lived. Within 72 hours, the story twisted. On July 30th, Traoré sent a letter that history will remember. He rejected the prize outright, not politely, not cautiously, but with thunder in his words. The Nobel, he declared, was no badge of peace. It was a trap, a velvet chain crafted by the G7, a golden mask hiding the iron fist of political dependency. What the world celebrated as honor, he unmasked as a leash. Inside Ouagadougou, whispers turned to gasps. They want to crown me only to control me, he told his advisors. His decision was more than a refusal. It was a manifesto. For decades, the Nobel had been portrayed as the summit of dignity. But Traoré asked, whose dignity? If the medal comes tied to conditions, to diplomatic pressure, to invisible contracts of loyalty, then is it truly a prize or simply another shackle? The numbers made the defiance even more staggering. The Nobel Peace Prize carries a financial value of roughly $1.1 million. But the true economic ecosystem attached to the award extends far beyond a single check. Foundations, lecture circuits, partnerships, and soft power networks linked to laureates move billions of dollars. Analysts in New York calculated that past Nobel winners had often secured between $200 million and $800 million in indirect funding over their careers. To reject it was not merely to walk away from prestige. It was to refuse a billion-dollar opportunity. And yet Traoré did not blink. At the very moment when Western capitals rushed to present his nomination as proof of Africa's progress, he asked a forbidden question. Progress for whom? Is peace defined by a committee in Oslo, or by the lived realities of nations long shackled by conditional aid, unfavorable trade deals, and diplomatic manipulation? To him, the Nobel was not an honor bestowed, but a mask enforced. Behind the gold was dependency. Behind the applause was silence. By the end of July, the world had seen something unprecedented. A sitting president, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, publicly rejecting it as an instrument of domination. The gesture carried the weight of centuries of resistance. The echoes of colonized voices that had been told their sovereignty was conditional, their dignity negotiable. With one stroke, Traoré shattered the illusion. In Ouagadougou, the air was electric. Supporters gathered in Independence Square, repeating his words, "Dignity is priceless." For some, it felt like the first crack in a glass ceiling that had long pressed down on African leadership. For others, it was reckless. A young leader discarding global legitimacy that could have secured investment and security for his struggling nation. The debate was immediate, fierce, and global. This was not merely about Burkina Faso. This was about the architecture of power itself. A prize meant to symbolize peace had been recast as a weapon of influence. A medal meant to unify had been unveiled as a tool of division. Traoré's act forced the world to confront a question too long ignored. Can true sovereignty exist if dignity is traded for applause? The story of July 2025 was not just the nomination of a young president. It was the moment he tore the veil away. And as his letter was sealed and dispatched, the shock waves traveled far beyond West Africa. Was this defiance a solitary gamble or the beginning of a continental awakening? The refusal was not a whisper. It was a thunderclap. The letter from Ouagadougou had barely reached Oslo before the world erupted. Cable networks lit up. Editorials poured in. Governments scrambled for words. And in that storm, the figure of Ibrahim Traoré grew larger, not smaller. In Washington, reactions fractured along familiar lines. On CNN, analysts condemned the move as reckless symbolism, warning that Burkina Faso risked losing up to $450 million in annual American aid. To them, this was political suicide. Yet on Fox News, a different question rang out. Was the Nobel itself compromised? That question, taboo in diplomatic circles, suddenly found airtime. Then came the moment no one expected. Donald Trump, wielding his influence in the global debate, admitted bluntly that the Nobel might indeed be a political trap. His words cut through the noise, validating what Traoré himself had declared. It was rare for an American voice to echo an African leader so directly, and the effect was seismic. Across the Atlantic, Paris erupted in fury. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly slammed his fist on the table, calling Traoré's refusal an insult to the moral order of the international community. For France, still reeling from a wave of anti-French sentiment in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso itself, the gesture was more than defiance. It was humiliation. Berlin responded more cautiously, but the language in confidential notes was striking. A diplomatic breach, a tear in the fabric of Western soft power. In Brussels, European Union officials whispered of a domino effect. If one African leader could defy the Nobel, what else might the continent begin to refuse? Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the reaction was measured but profound. Japan released a statement describing the refusal not as arrogance, but as a symptom of eroding trust in international institutions. For a nation that had pledged over $30 billion in development aid through its TICAD framework, the warning was sharp. If Africa no longer believed in Western-led legitimacy, how much longer before Japanese influence was also diluted? The question lingered uncomfortably among G7 capitals. But it was not only governments that responded. The digital sphere ignited like dry grass in the Sahel. Within hours, hashtags like Nobel Trap, Spirit of Traoré, and Africa Rising were trending from Lagos to São Paulo, from Johannesburg to Manila. TikTok clips of Traoré's fiery declaration reached 40 million views in less than 2 days. On university campuses in Accra, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, students recorded messages praising his courage. In Mexico City and São Paulo, activists tied his stand to their own struggles against financial dependency on the IMF and World Bank. Even in London and New York, diaspora communities rallied, waving banners that read, "Dignity has no price tag." The cultural wave was no less intense. Poets invoked the image of golden shackles breaking. Musicians sampled Traoré's speeches into songs of resistance. Murals appeared overnight on the streets of Kinshasa and Lagos, depicting the young leader holding a torch aloft with the words, "Integrity over illusion." What no award ceremony in Oslo could ever generate was born instead in the chaos of defiance. Raw, unfiltered resonance that spoke not only to Africans, but to every community weary of dependency disguised as partnership. Financial markets, too, felt the tremor. In New York and Frankfurt, analysts recalculated risk profiles. Credit default swap spreads widened by 120 basis points. Investors muttered about instability. And yet, in commodity markets, a different story unfolded. Futures contracts for Burkina gold surged. Traders speculated that if Africa began to trade outside traditional frameworks, new opportunities would arise. Perhaps in yuan, perhaps in rubles. Was one man's defiance enough to unsettle the dollar's grip on global trade? Some whispered that it might be. The geopolitical implications spread like ripples across a lake. In Tehran and Ankara, media hailed Traoré as the voice of a new Bandung spirit. In Caracas and Havana, leaders invoked his refusal as proof that the global South could say no. And in Addis Ababa, the African Union convened urgent discussions, debating whether the Nobel had lost all credibility for the continent. In the midst of this storm, one truth was undeniable. Traoré had done what no other sitting president had dared. He had ripped the mask off a prize long seen as untouchable. For some, he was a dangerous outlier, gambling with the future of his people. For others, he was a torchbearer, illuminating a path towards sovereignty. The Nobel, once a symbol of honor, now stood exposed as a stage for power politics. And so, as the world watched hashtags rise and currencies tremble, a question refused to fade. Did Traoré expose the mask of peace, or did he invite a storm too great to contain? Defiance carries a price. In the weeks after Traoré's thunderous refusal, Burkina Faso found itself at a crossroads. Western financial institutions adjusted their risk ratings. Credit agencies warned that the cost of borrowing could rise by 2 to 3 percentage points. On a $5 billion loan portfolio, that meant as much as $150 million extra every year in interest payments. To critics, this was proof that the rejection was reckless, a burden his fragile economy could not sustain. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, the mood was different. Vendors selling bread and fruit told journalists, "Better to lose a dollar given with strings than to lose our future bought with silence." For them, sovereignty was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible currency. They could count it not in cash, but in dignity. Inside the government, the decision reshaped national priorities. Instead of preparing victory tours or Nobel lectures, Traoré redirected attention to the nation's own resources. Gold mines, long managed by foreign contractors, were nationalized. Economists estimated that by keeping just $500 million annually in domestic circulation, schools could reopen, hospitals could expand, and farmers could receive subsidies for sustainable agriculture. Within a year, nearly 200,000 new students enrolled in classrooms once shuttered by conflict. Clinics that had relied on conditional aid received upgrades from domestic revenues. Solar fields began to rise in the Sahel, lighting villages that had lived in darkness for generations. The symbolism rippled through society like a drumbeat. In late July, the Independence Square hosted the Spirit of Traoré Festival. Tens of thousands gathered, waving banners with a simple slogan, "Dignity is priceless." Children recited folktales about golden chains broken, while musicians blended ancestral rhythms with modern beats, declaring sovereignty as the new song of the people. Economists noted that the festival itself generated $50 million in revenue through tourism, merchandise, and regional participation. It was a modest but telling sign. Dignity itself could become an economic driver. The diaspora, too, responded with fervor. Remittances surged to over $3 billion in 2025, a 40% increase compared to the year before. Families abroad framed their contributions as part of a larger movement, an act of solidarity with a nation refusing to bend. This was not mere charity. It was partnership from afar, the embodiment of Traoré's call for trade over aid. Culturally, the rejection sparked a renaissance. Poets and rappers released works titled "Integrity Over Illusion" and "We Are Not for Sale." Murals of Traoré appeared in Lagos and Nairobi, painted not by governments but by young artists inspired by his stand. Universities in Dakar, Addis Ababa, and Dar es Salaam introduced debates and lectures on post-colonial recognition, questioning whether Africa should ever again seek validation from Western prizes. In classrooms across Burkina Faso, teachers began including the event in civic education, framing it as an act of resistance equal to any battlefield victory. Yet the consequences were not purely symbolic. Western donors quietly reconsidered billions in aid packages. The European Union hinted at reviewing cooperation agreements. Financial institutions pressed harder on risk premiums. These pressures were real, heavy, and immediate. Still, the people appeared ready to endure. As one student in Accra declared, "If Ibrahim Traoré coup teaches us anything, it is that freedom is never free. But the debt we pay in dignity will last longer than any loan." This tension defined the national mood, the sharp edge between sacrifice and pride. Some feared isolation, reduced investment, and harsher economic terms. Others saw opportunity, the chance to chart a new course where sovereignty was not a slogan, but a strategy. For once, Africa was not waiting for applause from abroad. It was writing its own script. The paradox was sharp. By refusing a single medal, Burkina Faso lost access to certain funds, but gained something far greater, the image of self-respect. Citizens debated not whether the Nobel could buy peace, but whether peace could exist without dignity. In market stalls and classrooms, in music and murals, the conversation had shifted. Sovereignty was no longer a theory. It was a lived reality. Was this the cost of arrogance, or the first installment of a debt paid in dignity? The shock of refusal did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. It rippled outward, colliding with the delicate machinery of global diplomacy. For the West, the Nobel Peace Prize had long been more than a medal. It was a lever of legitimacy. To grant it was to bless, to withhold it was to punish. Yet here was a young African president who had spat out the apple in full view of the world. In Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi, The gesture was interpreted as a direct blow to Western soft power. Chinese analysts declared that the act exposed the psychology of dependency. Russian commentators praised Traoré for rejecting what they called Europe's velvet glove. In India, op-eds hailed the defiance as a revival of the non-aligned spirit, recalling Bandung's promise of independence from both East and West. In Latin America, leaders in Caracas and Havana compared the stand to their own struggles against Washington's dictates. Brazilian commentators went further, suggesting that this moment could accelerate a shift towards South-South solidarity. Across Asia, activists in Manila and Jakarta invoked his name in their own fights against conditional aid and lopsided trade deals. Europe's response was sharper. French officials called it a betrayal of the moral order, while German diplomats labeled it a breach in the fabric of trust. In Brussels, EU representatives debated quietly whether to continue awarding the prize to African leaders at all, fearing that future refusals might amplify the damage. The very tool designed to showcase Western benevolence had backfired, raising questions about its credibility. Japan's reaction, though measured, struck at the heart of the issue. By calling the refusal a symptom of eroding trust in international institutions, Tokyo voiced what many feared. If Africa no longer recognized Western legitimacy, then decades of carefully built partnerships might unravel. For a country that had invested over $30 billion through its Africa Development Conferences, the implications were sobering. Yet nowhere was the resonance stronger than on the African continent itself. The African Union convened urgent meetings. Some delegates floated the idea of a collective statement refusing symbolic prizes unless the awarding process was reformed. Others proposed building new recognition platforms within Africa, independent of Western committees. What began as one man's refusal was mutating into a broader debate about the continent's place in global governance. Intellectuals dubbed it the opening chapter of a Burkina Faso revolution, not fought with rifles or tanks, but with words, ideas, and defiance. And so, from Latin America to Asia, from Europe to Africa, the world was forced to confront a disturbing possibility. The Nobel was no longer untouchable. If one small landlocked nation could reject the most prestigious award in the world, what might others soon reject? IMF loans? World Bank conditions? Trade deals written in Brussels and Washington? If one small landlocked nation can, what stops the rest? The refusal of a medal was never the end. It was a beginning, a seed planted in contested soil. For Burkina Faso, the path ahead is both daunting and full of promise. The decision has already redrawn its political compass, but the larger question remains, where does this road lead? One possibility is isolation. Western donors may tighten their purse strings, multilateral institutions may raise borrowing costs, and foreign investors may hesitate. For a landlocked nation facing security challenges and economic pressures, the risks are real. A few percentage points added to interest rates could consume hundreds of millions annually, money desperately needed for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Critics warn that idealism cannot replace capital. Yet another possibility is liberation. The refusal has already energized discussions within the African Union about creating an African monetary fund, a financial institution immune to G7 pressure. Conversations about regional trade blocs free from Western rating agencies have gained momentum. In Cape Town, scholars compared Traoré's act to Mandela's insistence on dignity during negotiations, arguing that moral courage can create its own leverage. The momentum is not limited to Africa. In Latin America, activists have already cited Burkina Faso as proof that dependency can be rejected. In Southeast Asia, students have invoked Traoré in rallies against exploitative trade agreements. If defiance is contagious, then the reverberations could reshape alliances far beyond Ouagadougou. Domestically, the rejection has turned sovereignty into policy. Renewable energy projects worth over $2 billion are being negotiated without IMF strings. Agricultural subsidies are shifting the nation closer to food security. Diaspora remittances are rising, not only as economic flows but as statements of solidarity. Even culture itself has been weaponized. Music, poetry, and art carrying the message that dignity is priceless. This is the paradox of Traoré's path. By refusing one prize, he may have unlocked a new framework for development, one based not on applause from abroad, but on investment at home and solidarity across the global South. Yet the challenges remain immense. Can a small nation withstand the pressure of global markets and geopolitical isolation? Or will the moral fire he lit prove strong enough to attract new partnerships from those equally disillusioned with Western dominance? The road ahead is uncertain, but its direction is clear. Sovereignty is no longer a slogan. It is a strategy. And the torch now lit in Ouagadougou could burn across the continent, illuminating choices that once seemed impossible. The world now waits. Will Africa turn this spark into a fire that reshapes the map? The story of a medal refused is, in truth, the story of a continent awakening. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world and said no, he was not merely rejecting a golden trinket from Europe. He was rewriting the script of African dignity. The Nobel, often framed as the crown of peace, was revealed instead as a golden shackle. By casting it aside, Traoré declared that true honor does not come from applause abroad, but from the sweat and resilience of a people who choose sovereignty over submission. This act has already become more than an event. It is a doctrine. In classrooms across Africa, children now hear that sovereignty is defended not only with armies, but with ideas. In festivals, citizens sing that dignity itself can fuel prosperity. In parliaments and universities, leaders debate how to free their economies from dependency disguised as recognition. What began as a single refusal is now studied as a manifesto, the spark of a Burkina Faso revolution in the 21st century. But the ripples do not end in Ouagadougou. Across Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, voices rise to echo the same demand. Legitimacy cannot be bought with medals, nor peace defined by those who profit from war. It is no coincidence that analysts speak of the Ibrahim Traoré coup not as an isolated gesture, but as the possible template for a new world order. If one small nation can resist gilded chains, what prevents others from following? If one leader can reject symbolic prizes, why not reject exploitative trade, lopsided aid, and the false generosity of those who dictate terms? And yet the question remains, will this defiance endure? History is filled with moments of courage that faded into silence. But sometimes a single act crystallizes into legacy. By invoking dignity as a currency more valuable than dollars, by proving that integrity outweighs applause, Traoré has placed his nation, and perhaps his continent, on a path no medal could ever secure. The Ibrahim Traoré coup may not have earned him a gilded prize in Oslo, but it has earned him something greater, the trust of a generation who refused to bow. And that trust, once awakened, is more powerful than any check, more enduring than any headline. If this moment speaks to your sense of justice, let your voice join ours. Save this video, share it, and walk with us.